My name's Mary Nolan. I was born Mary Dottie. I lived in a small farm on the west of Ireland in the border of Mayo and Sligo. I'm an only child of, I lived with my mum and dad, and we worked the land together. So the seasons were marked by milking cows and saving hay and going to the bog. And the bog is at the bottom of our land, so it's an extension of where I am and an extension of who I am in lots of regards. Turf was part of the land or the bog is part of the land that we farmed, but it was also part of how we warmed ourselves in the winter. So we had both a stove and an open fire that was always on the go. And as you know from your time here in Ireland, it can be wet and cold, and so having a good warm fire in a warm house to come home to is very important. We spent every summer in the bog, and some of them were dry summers and some of them were marked by very wet summers, but the turf always had to be saved. We'd go up. It was a nice experience growing up. It was just part of life rather than anything in particular. Myself and mum and dad, we'd get onto the tractor, the transport box at the back of the tractor, and we'd bring up the supplies for the day. So you went up to the bog for the day to turn the turf first and then foot it and then bring it home. And you'd bring up the supplies, and the supplies were tea, and tea didn't come in flasks in those days. They came in bottles. So there was a bottle, probably an old whiskey bottle or an old bottle, glass bottle, and you'd make the tea and put the milk in it, and then you'd wrap it in a tea towel. And there'd be egg sandwiches, or on a rare occasion ham sandwiches, but it was your supplies for going up, and maybe a packet of biscuits. And up you'd go. And so the first process in the turf is you have to turn it. If it's a particularly dry year, you could go straight into footing, but that's only on rare occasions. Mostly you have to turn them. And it's back-breaking work and leg-breaking work. There's long rows, and we'll see them tomorrow in some of the slides that I have to show you. You go down, and so we take rows each, and then it was like a little competition of who got to the row first. And then of course when I was younger I always got bored and I'd go wandering off into the bog. But you had to be careful in the bog, because the bog was potentially a very dangerous place also. There was lots of bog holes, and lots of bog holes that you could see, and there was water in those, and they could be quite deep, and there was always tales of people who slipped in and got into trouble in them. But there was also the other bog holes, which were the ones covered over by the heather, and they were more dangerous because you may not see them, and if you slipped into them, and you can go for miles in the bog without meeting anybody, although you could, if it was a good day, you could end up seeing neighbours coming around turning their plot of bog. But if you fell into a bog hole and it was and someone didn't know where you were, it was very dangerous, because it's a little like quicksand. The ground goes from underneath you, in that the more you struggle, the more the bog takes you in. And so you have to let go and be calm, and hopefully someone will hear you shout, or you'll be able to hold on to or pull yourself out. But there were always dangers associated with the bog, but it was always a great fun place to be. I really enjoyed it, and I really hated it in the same breath. It was a time there was always great crack because something had happened, or someone had. So there was good fun at the bog, along with it being back-breaking work. And then, as I said, the neighbours, if it was a fine day, you could see them in the far distance, and then they'd wander over to you, or you'd wander over to them. And that was always a very a nice time to be around. Then there was the footing the turf, which is turning them into like little houses, and then you brought them home. On dry summers, you bring the tractor and the trailer in, and you throw the turf into it and you bring it home. But on wet summers, I remember having to carry the sods of turf out onto the road, so that you could get it on, dry it out further before you could bring it home. And then sometimes, and you'll see it in the pictures too, bagging the turf, put it into bags, plastic bags, before you could bring it out of the. So there's different, and that happened more in later years. The bringing the turf too was a big day. You normally got some neighbours, some 2 or 3 neighbours would come together and they'd help you and you'd help them in return. So there was a big setup. Mum would have to stay at home to cook the dinner and have the food ready for everybody. There'd be the crew that was up on the bog that'd be filling the turf into the bog. There was the tractor driver who brought the trailer back, and then there'd be 2 or 3 in the shed piling the turf into the shed. And if you were unlucky enough, you were the person at the back of the shed that had to make sure that the shed was full. So it was not a nice place to be, because as you filled the turf up to the roof, and the turf mold, the dust, it was coming off it, and it was not a pleasant place if you had to be the person making sure that the last of it was stacked in. But it was part of life. We did it every year, and every farm did that, and it happened like that, where you'd go to neighbours and the neighbours would come to you, especially for the bringing it home. The turning of the turf you normally did in your own, everybody did their own turf. But then for the bringing it home, you came together as a community. And then in later years, I lived around home for almost all my life, bar where I went to college in Galway, and I came back and I lived for a few years in Sligo. But when I had my own kids, myself and Steve built a house just over the road from our home house, and we brought in geothermal energy into our house. So we heat our house with underfloor heating by geothermal, and in later years we've got solar panels and all. So we don't really need an open fire at all. We have one and we do sometimes use it, but it's more for effect in the winter. It's kind of a warming effect, the fire. But we don't use as much of the turf anymore. But my mum, when she died in 2022, she wanted the fire all of the time. And you go in, and it was like being in the Bahamas or something. You'd nearly need to have your swimsuit with you because it was so hot. She loved that really hot, warm room. But when my kids were growing up, then they were still, I used to bring them to the bog, and it was very important to me that they experienced that life of turning turf and footing turf and bringing home the turf, although it wasn't at the same scale as it was when I was young. When I was young, we relied solely on turf to heat the house, but in later years, there, coal and other things started to come in. I suppose when I was really young, we couldn't afford turf or a few coal, so turf was the source of fuel for the house. So when my kids came along, there wasn't the same demands on the communities having been solely reliant on turf anymore. It was important for me that my kids understand their heritage and where they came from and their relationship to the land and to the bog. And they came down, and actually it's funny, when as part of the project, I would put out a call for photos or images or tales that people had of the bog, and very few photos existed of that time, because it really wasn't, there wasn't the same cameras as there is back then as there is now, but there was very little photographic evidence of people been on the bog. And even in our own house, we have pictures of the bog only from when visitors had come and they went up and they took pictures of the bog. So it wasn't a thing that we documented our heritage or our way of life, I suppose, at that time. It's funny enough, in the lockdown during COVID, the bog brought in renewed importance for me, really, because it became a place where I could walk, and we were restricted, as they were in many parts of the world, as to how far you could go from home. But I could go up the bog and I never meet anyone. It was, you were up there and it was freedom. It was away from all of the things that was going on, and you didn't know what was going to happen, and you were in a familiar environment that in lots of ways didn't change from when my parents or my grandparents would have been saving turf on the bog, or when they were walking the bog. And it's quite a nice realization that in some ways some things don't change so much over time.